Hey man, most men think attraction is built by saying more compliments, more explanations, more reassurance, more messages, more attempts to prove that you're different from every other guy. But sometimes the exact opposite happens. The more desperately a man tries to create attraction through his words, the more his words lose weight. Think about the difference between a man who says something because he genuinely means it, and a man who says something because he's watching her face, desperately waiting for approval. Same sentence, completely different energy. One communicates from confidence, the other communicates from need, and people can often sense that difference long before they can explain it. That's why the way you talk matters far more than memorizing some magical collection of lines. Your words reveal whether you're comfortable with yourself, whether you need validation, whether you have boundaries, and whether you're actually listening or simply waiting for your opportunity to impress her. The first thing you need to understand is that you don't have to agree with everything she says. This sounds obvious, but watch what happens when an insecure man talks to a woman he finds extremely attractive. Suddenly, every opinion she has becomes brilliant. She loves a movie he hates. Somehow, he loves it too. She gives an opinion he completely disagrees with. He immediately finds a way to agree. Why? Because underneath the conversation is fear. If I disagree, maybe she won't like me. But brother, if your entire personality disappears the moment a beautiful woman enters the room, what exactly is she supposed to become interested in? Healthy disagreement creates dimension. You can smile and say, I completely disagree with you on that one, and then explain why, without becoming argumentative. You're not challenging her to establish dominance, you're simply showing that attraction hasn't erased your identity. And here's something surprisingly powerful. Actually listen to what she says, instead of waiting for your turn to perform. Most people aren't used to being genuinely heard. They're used to someone waiting for a pause so they can tell their own story. So when she mentions something meaningful, don't immediately redirect the conversation toward yourself. Ask about it. If she says she changed careers 3 years ago, instead of saying, oh, my friend did that too, you might ask, what finally made you decide to leave? Suddenly the conversation goes somewhere deeper. One question leads to a story. The story reveals values, fears, ambitions, mistakes. That's where connection starts becoming personal. The goal isn't to interrogate her with 20 questions. It's to notice the emotional doors she naturally opens and occasionally walk through one of them. Then there's playfulness, brother. And this is where many conversations either come alive or die completely. If every conversation sounds like a job interview, where are you from? What do you do? How many siblings do you have? What are your hobbies? There may be information exchanged, but almost no emotional texture. Playfulness changes that. She tells you she takes 20 minutes choosing what to order, and you smile. So basically, I'm going to need snacks while you're reading the menu. She laughs and pushes back. Now there's energy. You're creating something between the two of you, instead of simply exchanging biographies. But teasing only works when warmth is underneath it. If you're deliberately attacking insecurities, embarrassing her, or trying to lower her confidence so she'll seek your approval, that's not charisma. That's insecurity wearing a clever costume. Cantois, another thing confident men do differently, is they aren't afraid of small moments of silence. An insecure man believes every second must be filled because silence feels like failure. So he talks faster, changes subjects unnecessarily, tells stories that aren't going anywhere. The conversation becomes exhausting because he's desperately trying to prevent a quiet moment from appearing. But a relaxed man can finish a thought, smile, take a sip of his drink, look around, and allow 2 seconds to exist without panicking. That sounds ridiculously simple, but psychologically it communicates comfort. You're not desperately trying to control the interaction. You're comfortable enough to let it breathe. And ironically, once you're comfortable with silence, your actual words begin carrying more weight because they aren't buried beneath an endless stream of nervous talking. And stop giving compliments like you're handing out flyers on a street corner. If you tell her she's beautiful 5 times during the first conversation, the 6th time doesn't suddenly become more powerful. Compliments become meaningful through specificity and sincerity. Maybe everyone notices her appearance, but you notice the way she becomes animated when talking about something she loves. Maybe instead of saying, "You're so hot," for the 10th time, you tell her, "You get this completely different energy when you're talking about your work." You clearly care about it. Now you're communicating that you're actually paying attention to the person rather than simply reacting to the surface. Again, don't manufacture observations because you heard they're attractive. If you don't genuinely mean something, don't say it. Authenticity is difficult to fake consistently. Another powerful quality is the ability to communicate boundaries without turning them into threats. Suppose she repeatedly cancels plans at the last minute. The insecure man says nothing because he's terrified she'll disappear if he complains. Then resentment quietly builds until eventually he explodes. Another man tries to play games and deliberately ignores her for 3 days to punish her. Neither response is particularly strong. You can simply say, "I understand things come up, but last-minute cancellations don't really work for me." If you're unsure, let's plan when you know you're free. Calm, clear, no lecture, no threat. You're not trying to control her. You're communicating the conditions under which you're willing to participate. People often respect boundaries more when they aren't delivered with anger, because calm boundaries reveal that you don't need drama to take yourself seriously, and learn to stop explaining yourself after you've already communicated clearly. This is one of the biggest conversational differences between confidence and anxiety. You say you can't meet tonight because you already have plans. That's enough. But the anxious man immediately starts adding paragraphs. "It's not that I don't want to see you. I promised my friend 2 weeks ago, and we haven't hung out in forever, but maybe I could leave early, and I hope you're not upset. Why are you negotiating against yourself? You haven't done anything wrong." Over-explaining often reveals that you're afraid of someone's reaction. You can be considerate without behaving like every decision requires permission. "Can't tonight, I'm free Saturday though." Warm, simple, honest. Your words become stronger when you trust them enough to stop defending them unnecessarily. Then there's emotional control. And no, that doesn't mean becoming some emotionless statue who never admits anything bothers him. It means your emotions don't hijack every conversation. If she disagrees with you, you don't immediately become defensive. If she jokes about something, you don't treat it like an attack on your masculinity. If she needs a night to herself, you don't automatically assume another man exists. You ask questions before making accusations. You respond to what's actually happening instead of whatever worst-case scenario your insecurity created. That makes communication feel safer because she doesn't have to constantly manage your emotional reactions. And the interesting part is that a man who doesn't explode easily doesn't need to speak loudly to be taken seriously. Calmness gives his words weight. So, the secret isn't finding some psychologically engineered sentence that makes a woman obsessed. There's no universal phrase that overrides another person's mind, and anyone selling you that fantasy is selling you theater. The real difference is learning to communicate without begging for approval. Listen carefully, speak honestly, disagree without becoming hostile, tease without becoming disrespectful, compliment what you genuinely notice, set boundaries without threatening, let silence exist without panicking, and above everything else, stop treating every conversation with an attractive woman like an audition where she decides whether you're worthy. You're evaluating her too. Does she listen? Does she respect you? Can she disagree maturely? Is the conversation reciprocal? Once you enter interactions with that mindset, your communication becomes naturally more compelling because you're no longer speaking to convince someone to choose you. You're speaking to discover whether choosing each other actually makes sense. And here's where conversation becomes even more powerful, brother. Stop being afraid to have an opinion she might not like. A lot of men misunderstand attraction and think the safest path is becoming agreeable enough that there's never any friction. But if every sentence coming out of your mouth is designed to avoid disagreement, eventually she isn't talking to you, she's talking to a reflection of herself. Suppose she says, "I could never live outside a big city." You don't need to immediately say, "Same." If you'd rather disappear into the mountains, say it, laugh about it, explain why, let her argue her side. Those little differences give conversation texture because now two actual personalities are interacting. And if respectful disagreement is enough to destroy someone's interest in you, pretending to agree wouldn't have created a healthy connection anyway. Confidence isn't making sure you're always right. It's being comfortable enough with yourself that someone else is allowed to think you're wrong. Another thing confident men understand is that not every statement needs to become an opportunity to prove themselves. She mentions she loves traveling, and suddenly the insecure guy starts listing every country he's ever visited. She says she likes ambitious men, and now he's giving her his 5-year business plan. She mentions fitness, and suddenly he's explaining his entire workout routine. Brother, relax. When you're constantly trying to demonstrate value, you're quietly communicating that you're afraid your value won't be noticed naturally. Let conversation breathe. Sometimes she tells a story and you simply listen. Sometimes you ask another question instead of immediately producing a bigger story of your own. The man who's comfortable with himself doesn't need to win every conversational exchange. He knows he doesn't have to reveal everything impressive about himself in the first 30 minutes just to keep someone's attention. Mintzig and learn the difference between asking questions and conducting an interview. Questions become attractive when they're connected to what she actually says. She tells you she moved across the country alone at 22, and instead of jumping to the next generic question, you say, "That must have been terrifying. What made you actually do it?" Now you're exploring something meaningful. She tells you the story, maybe laughs about how badly the first month went, and suddenly you're discussing courage, family, independence, mistakes. That's how conversations become memorable. You don't need 50 clever topics prepared beforehand. You need enough presence to recognize when the conversation has naturally handed you something interesting. Most people are so busy thinking about what they'll say next that they completely miss what's being offered right in front of them. Then there's something almost nobody teaches men. Don't be afraid to end a conversation while it's still good. Not because you're playing some scarcity game, but because every interaction doesn't need to be stretched until both people have nothing left to say. You had a great conversation, you're supposed to meet your friends, so you smile and say, "I've got to go, but this was fun." That's it. You don't suddenly abandon your plans because chemistry appeared. And that communicates something healthy. You enjoyed her company, but your life didn't disappear the moment she became interesting. Ironically, conversations often remain more memorable when they end naturally, instead of being dragged another 40 minutes because one person is terrified that ending the interaction means losing the opportunity forever. Another quality that changes everything is specificity. Generic conversation creates generic emotion. How was your day? Fine. But if she told you yesterday that she had an important presentation, asking, "So, did you destroy that presentation? Or did the presentation destroy you?" feels completely different. Why? Because it communicates memory, personality, and attention at the same time. You're showing that what she told you didn't disappear from your mind the second the conversation ended. And brother, people notice when they're genuinely remembered. Not because you memorize facts about them like you're studying for an exam, but because interest naturally makes details stick. The strongest conversationalists don't constantly search for impressive things to say. They make the other person feel like previous conversations actually mattered. And don't underestimate the power of telling a good story. Not bragging, a story. There's a difference. If something funny happened during a trip, don't just say, "Yeah, I've been to Italy." Tell her about getting on the wrong train and realizing 40 minutes later you were going in completely the wrong direction. Give her something she can picture. Human beings connect through stories because stories carry emotion. They reveal personality without requiring you to announce your personality directly. You don't need to say, "I'm adventurous." Tell the story and let her decide. You don't need to say, "I'm funny." If you're funny, it'll show. The more you constantly label yourself, the more it sounds like advertising. Let experiences reveal who you are. There's another habit that can instantly change the emotional tone of a conversation. Sometimes challenge the assumption behind what she says, rather than automatically accepting it. She says, "I'm terrible at relationships." Instead of rushing to reassure her, "No, I'm sure you're amazing," you might smile and ask, "What makes you say that?" Now, she has to explain herself. Maybe there's a funny story behind it. Maybe there's something deeper. Maybe she realizes she was exaggerating. The point isn't to psychoanalyze her, it's to avoid becoming the guy whose automatic response is validation, regardless of what was actually said. Genuine reassurance means something precisely because it isn't automatic. If every sentence receives approval, approval becomes meaningless. And learn how to give emotional validation without surrendering your own perspective. Suppose she's frustrated about something that happened at work. You don't immediately need to solve it, but you also don't need to agree that everyone else involved is terrible just because she's upset. You can say, "Yeah, I can understand why that annoyed you," while still later offering another perspective if it's useful. That's emotional maturity. You're acknowledging the experience without pretending her interpretation must automatically become yours. A lot of men swing between two extremes, trying to fix everything or agreeing with everything. Sometimes the strongest response is simply understanding first. People become far more receptive to another perspective after they feel heard. Then there's your tone, and brother, tone can completely change the meaning of identical words. "You're ridiculous," said with irritation, creates conflict. The exact same phrase, delivered with a smile after she tells you something funny, creates playfulness. That's why communication can't be reduced to scripts. Men search online for the exact sentence that makes women attracted, copy it word for word, and then wonder why it sounds unnatural coming from them. Because the sentence isn't the magic. Context is, timing is, your relationship with the person is, your facial expression is. Whether there's trust underneath the interaction is. Stop collecting lines and start developing social awareness. A man who understands the moment doesn't need 20 memorized phrases because he can respond naturally to what's actually happening. And that's the deeper lesson here, brother. The conversations people remember aren't necessarily the ones where somebody said the most impressive things. They're the conversations where they felt something: curiosity, laughter, comfort, challenge, understanding, excitement. You create that by being present rather than performing. You listen instead of waiting to speak. You disagree without turning everything into a debate. You tease without humiliating. You ask questions because you're genuinely curious instead of because you're following some attraction formula. And most importantly, you don't walk into every interaction thinking, "How can I make this woman obsessed with me?" That mindset makes you manipulative before the conversation even begins. Walk in thinking, "Let's see who this person actually is." Now you're relaxed, you're curious, you're evaluating too. And ironically, that's when your communication becomes far more compelling, because instead of desperately trying to create attraction, you're finally giving attraction enough space to happen naturally. And here's another thing that separates a compelling conversation from a forgettable one. You don't always take the safest possible path. Most men become painfully predictable around a woman they really like because they're terrified of saying anything that could create friction. So every answer becomes polished, neutral, and harmless. She says she loves something, he loves it too. She complains about something, he immediately agrees. She tells a questionable story, and instead of giving his genuine reaction, he gives the reaction he thinks will earn approval. But safe conversation eventually becomes boring conversation because there's nothing real underneath it. Sometimes the memorable response is simply the honest one. Maybe she tells you she spends 3 hours getting ready, and you laugh. 3 hours? I'm going to have to tell you, dinner starts at 4. If I want you there by 7. You're not attacking her, you're playing with what she gave you. The conversation has movement because you aren't constantly afraid that one imperfect sentence will destroy everything. And here's something else. Stop answering every question as if you're standing in front of a jury. She asks what you did Saturday. The anxious man gives a detailed timeline because somewhere inside him, he's trying to make his life sound interesting enough. But confidence doesn't feel obligated to turn every answer into evidence of value. Sometimes, went hiking with a couple friends and nearly died because one of them apparently thinks he's a mountain goat, gives her more to work with than a 5-minute explanation of every place you visited. Good conversation leaves doors open. It gives the other person something to grab onto. She can ask where you went, laugh about your friend, tell you her own hiking disaster. Conversation is less about delivering perfect answers and more about creating enough emotional hooks that both people naturally keep building on what the other said. Another powerful shift happens when you stop trying to remove every bit of tension from an interaction. A little uncertainty is normal when two people are getting to know each other. You don't need to immediately define everything. You don't need to know after 3 conversations exactly how she feels about you. You don't need to constantly ask whether she's enjoying herself. If she's sitting there laughing, asking questions, contributing to the conversation, and choosing to stay, trust the evidence in front of you. Insecure men constantly seek verbal reassurance because they don't trust their ability to read reality. Are you having fun? Do you like me? Was that okay? Once or twice, these questions are harmless. Constantly asking them places the emotional burden on her to keep confirming that you're doing well. Relax enough to let an interaction speak for itself, and don't be afraid to let her discover that you have standards too. This doesn't mean interrogating her about her relationship history or giving her a list of requirements like she's applying for a position. It means your questions naturally reveal that you're interested in character, not simply appearance. Maybe she talks about a friendship she's maintained for 15 years, and you become genuinely curious about what kept them close. Maybe she describes how she handled a difficult situation, and you notice something about her resilience. Suddenly, the interaction communicates something subtle. You're not simply sitting there thinking, she's beautiful, please choose me. You're learning who she is. Attraction got your attention, but character determines whether your attention remains. That mindset changes everything, because now the conversation isn't an audition where you're the only candidate. Both people are discovering whether the other belongs in their life. Then there's one of the simplest conversational skills that almost nobody practices: remembering emotional details, not just factual ones. Maybe she told you she had an interview on Tuesday. Remembering that is good. But remembering that she was nervous because she really wanted to prove something to herself is deeper. So later you don't simply ask, "How was the interview?" You say, "So, did you walk out feeling like you proved yourself?" That communicates that you weren't only collecting information. You understood why the information mattered to her, and that's what makes people feel seen. Brother, there are millions of men capable of telling a beautiful woman she's beautiful. That's obvious information. What becomes more meaningful is recognizing something about her that required actually paying attention. But don't turn emotional awareness into amateur therapy. This is another trap. Some men learn that women appreciate being understood, so suddenly they're analyzing every sentence, diagnosing childhood wounds, and trying to become the person who fixes everything. That's exhausting, and it can create an unhealthy dynamic where connection becomes emotional dependency. Sometimes she tells you she had a terrible day, and the correct response isn't a 15-minute psychological analysis. Sometimes it's, "That sounds brutal. Come on, let's get food." You can care without turning every emotion into a project. You're her potential partner, not an unpaid therapist auditioning for permanent employment. Healthy connection includes emotional support, but it also includes laughter, ordinary conversation, independence, and the ability to handle some problems separately. And learn how to respond when she challenges you, because it's easy to appear confident when everything is going your way. The real test comes when she disagrees, teases you, questions something you said, or doesn't immediately respond the way you expected. Do you become defensive? Do you start explaining yourself desperately? Do you suddenly become cold because your ego got touched? Or can you stay relaxed enough to hear what she's actually saying? Sometimes she'll have a point, admit it. Okay, I'll give you that one. There's nothing weak about changing your mind when someone makes a better argument. In fact, insecurity needs to win every disagreement. Confidence can lose a tiny argument without feeling like it lost status. There's also enormous power in being able to say exactly what you mean without wrapping everything in layers of ambiguity. If you enjoyed seeing her, say, "I had a good time tonight." You don't need to pretend you didn't care, because some dating rule told you showing interest destroys attraction. If you want to see her again, suggest it. The key is that you're expressing desire without attaching desperation to it. "Let's grab dinner Thursday" feels completely different from "Please tell me when you're free. I'll literally make any day work." One communicates interest. The other communicates that your entire schedule is available for rearrangement around someone you've barely begun knowing. Directness becomes attractive when it's supported by self-respect. And if she says no, this is where your communication reveals more about you than any clever line ever could. Maybe she's genuinely busy. Maybe she's not interested. Maybe the timing isn't right. You don't need to argue with her decision. You don't ask for a detailed explanation of why. You don't become insulting because your ego suddenly needs to reduce her value. You accept the information. If she suggests another time, great. If she gives you repeated vague rejections without offering alternatives, you take the hint and continue living. Being able to hear no without emotionally falling apart communicates something important, not to her, but to yourself. Your dignity isn't dependent on every person you desire, desiring you back. And that's where the so-called dark psychology becomes far less mysterious, brother. People search for secret phrases, manipulation techniques, psychological triggers, and conversational tricks because they want control over an outcome that can never be completely controlled. But the strongest communicator isn't secretly controlling the woman sitting across from him. He's controlling himself. His anxiety doesn't make him overtalk. Attraction doesn't erase his opinions. Rejection doesn't destroy his confidence. Her beauty doesn't automatically place her above him. He can listen without becoming submissive, disagree without becoming aggressive, flirt without becoming disrespectful, show interest without becoming needy, and walk away without becoming bitter. That's what gives his words weight. Not because he discovered some forbidden psychological technique, but because behind those words is a man who isn't begging them to produce a particular reaction. And when your words come from that place, brother, people don't just hear what you're saying, they feel the certainty behind it. And there is another conversational habit that changes everything. Stop rushing to fill every emotional gap with reassurance. Sometimes she says, "I probably look terrible today," and the automatic response is to immediately flood her with compliments. Sometimes that's sincere and completely fine, but if every moment of insecurity produces an avalanche of validation from you, eventually your reassurance can become predictable rather than meaningful. Instead, listen to what she's actually saying. Maybe she's joking. Maybe she's genuinely having a rough day. Maybe she simply wants to talk. You don't need a rehearsed response. You might smile and say, "You've survived worse." Or if she genuinely seems upset, tell her something specific you appreciate about her. The point is that your words should respond to reality, not to your fear that you need to constantly make her feel good so she'll keep liking you. When reassurance comes from choice rather than anxiety, it carries more weight. And learn to talk about your ambitions without turning the conversation into a sales presentation. A man with direction doesn't need to announce every 5 minutes that he's ambitious. You can hear purpose in the way he talks about what he's building. He becomes more animated when discussing something meaningful. He knows where he's trying to go, even if he hasn't arrived yet. That's compelling because purpose gives conversation depth. But brother, don't fake ambition because you think women want to hear it. Saying you're building an empire while spending every afternoon doing nothing isn't attractive, it's theater. Talk honestly about what matters to you. Maybe you're starting something small. Maybe you're changing careers. Maybe you're still figuring it out. Authentic direction is far more interesting than exaggerated success because people eventually notice whether your lifestyle matches your words. Another skill most men underestimate is knowing when not to give advice. She tells you about a problem and your brain immediately starts constructing a solution. That's natural, but sometimes the first thing someone wants isn't a strategy. They want to feel understood. Instead of instantly saying, "Here's what you should do," ask, "Do you want my opinion, or do you just need to vent for a minute?" Brother, that one distinction can prevent so many unnecessary arguments because now you're not guessing what she needs from the conversation. Maybe she says, "No, tell me what you think." Great. Now your advice is invited. Maybe she says, "Honestly, I just need to complain." Fine, listen. Communication becomes dramatically easier when you stop assuming every problem presented to you is automatically a problem you're responsible for solving. And when you do give your opinion, give it honestly. Don't secretly edit your advice into whatever you think she wants to hear. If she asks what you think about something and you disagree, say so respectfully. "If you want my actual opinion, I think you're being too hard on yourself here." Or maybe the opposite. "I understand why you're upset, but I think you were wrong on that one." That second sentence scares insecure men because they believe attraction requires permanent agreement, but a healthy person doesn't need a partner who validates every decision regardless of reality. Sometimes respect grows precisely because someone knows you'll tell them the truth without humiliating them. There's a massive difference between honesty and cruelty. Honesty says what needs saying while still respecting the person hearing it. Then there's flirting, brother. And the best flirting usually doesn't feel like someone is desperately trying to flirt. It's woven naturally into conversation. Maybe she says something ridiculously competitive and you tell her, "I'm beginning to realize losing is emotionally impossible for you." She laughs and argues. You smile. Conversation continues. That's different from forcing sexual comments into every interaction because you think you need to create attraction. Forced flirting creates pressure. Natural playfulness creates possibility. Read the room. If she's reciprocating, the interaction can gradually become more playful. If she isn't, don't push harder. Social intelligence is partly knowing when an energy is being returned and when you're trying to manufacture something that isn't there. And don't make every conversation available 24 hours a day. Again, not because scarcity is some secret weapon, but because human beings have lives. If you're working, work. If you're with friends, be with your friends. If you're sleeping, sleep. You don't need to maintain an endless digital conversation from sunrise until midnight just to prove interest. Sometimes a conversation ends naturally and resumes tomorrow. That's healthy. When you're secure, silence doesn't automatically mean something went wrong. You don't send 3 additional messages because 20 minutes pass without a reply. You understand that another person's life continues when you're not actively speaking to them. That sounds basic, but anxiety turns basic things into emotional emergencies. Here's another difference between confidence and performance. Confident men can admit when they don't know something. She brings up a subject you know absolutely nothing about. You don't need to pretend. I have no idea what you're talking about. Explain it to me. That's actually a much stronger response than bluffing your way through the conversation, because you're afraid ignorance will make you look less impressive. Nobody knows everything, and when you're comfortable admitting that, you create another opportunity for her to contribute. Maybe she's passionate about the subject, and suddenly she gets to teach you something. Her face changes, her energy rises. Now the conversation isn't you constantly demonstrating your value, it's two people exchanging worlds. And if you genuinely like something about her, say it without turning the compliment into a negotiation. I like how passionate you are about that, period. You don't need to stare at her afterward, waiting for a compliment in return. You don't need to follow it with, do you like that about me too? Give appreciation because you mean it. That's what separates genuine warmth from validation seeking. A confident man can make someone feel appreciated without secretly presenting an invoice afterward. And because his compliments aren't constantly thrown around, people understand that when he says something positive, he probably means it. The same principle applies when something bothers you. Don't collect resentment for 3 months and then explode over something tiny. Speak earlier and speak calmer. Hey, when you joke about that in front of everyone, I don't like it. Simple, maybe she didn't realize it bothered you. Maybe she apologizes and stops. Problem solved. If she dismisses you and repeatedly does it anyway, now you have useful information about her character. Boundaries aren't primarily about changing another person's behavior. They're about determining what you will do when behavior continues. That's why the strongest boundary doesn't need a dramatic speech behind it. It has consequences, because you're genuinely willing to act on what you said. And that's where all of this comes together, brother. The way you talk becomes powerful when your words are connected to something solid underneath them. Your compliments mean something because you don't hand them out desperately. Your disagreement means something because you aren't trying to dominate. Your silence feels comfortable because you aren't terrified of losing attention. Your boundaries carry weight because you'll actually respect them yourself. Your questions feel different because you're genuinely listening to the answers. That's what men misunderstand when they hear phrases like dark psychology. They imagine there must be some forbidden sequence of words capable of controlling attraction. But the strongest communication isn't built on controlling someone else's mind. It's built on not losing control of your own. When you can sit across from a woman you find incredibly attractive and remain curious, playful, honest, calm, and completely yourself, you don't need psychological tricks. She gets something much rarer, an interaction with a man who isn't secretly begging every sentence to make her choose him. Once you understand this, you begin noticing that some of the strongest conversations aren't built around trying to impress her at all. They're built around making the interaction feel alive. There's a difference. An insecure man enters every conversation thinking, what can I say that makes me look attractive? A socially confident man is thinking about what's actually happening between them. Maybe she tells a ridiculous story and he calls out the funniest part. Maybe she makes an assumption about him and he smiles and says, you've known me 20 minutes and you've already written my biography. She laughs, explains herself, and suddenly there's an energy between them that couldn't have been created by another generic compliment. That's because chemistry isn't usually created by one person performing while the other evaluates. It's created when both people begin contributing to a little world that exists only inside that conversation. Point 2. And this is why being unpredictable doesn't mean behaving inconsistently. A lot of men confuse those two things. They hear that predictability can reduce excitement, so they deliberately become hot and cold. One day they're affectionate, the next day they're distant. One day they respond immediately, the next day they intentionally disappear. Brother, that's not mystery. That's instability. Healthy unpredictability comes from having personality. Maybe sometimes you're serious, sometimes you're playful, sometimes you're talking about your ambitions, and 10 minutes later, you're arguing passionately about why pineapple absolutely belongs or doesn't belong on pizza. She doesn't know exactly where every conversation will go because you're actually engaging with the moment. But underneath that variety, your character remains predictable. You're respectful, you're honest, you're consistent. That's the combination people trust. Emotional stability without conversational boredom. Another thing that makes conversation memorable is being willing to notice contradictions without attacking the person. Maybe she tells you she hates attention and then spends 10 minutes describing the birthday party she planned entirely around herself. You smile and say, "Wait, didn't you just tell me 5 minutes ago that you hate attention?" Now she laughs because she's been caught contradicting herself. Maybe she explains the difference. Maybe she playfully argues back. Either way, you're showing that you actually listen. You're not sitting there hypnotized by her appearance, agreeing with every sentence, but notice the tone. You're not saying, "See, women are hypocrites." You're saying, "Hold on, those two things don't match." Curiosity keeps the interaction playful, judgment turns it hostile. And learn to recognize when a conversation is becoming too one-sided. If you've asked 8 questions and she hasn't asked one about you, don't panic and start working twice as hard. Give the interaction some space. Maybe she's nervous and eventually opens up. Maybe she simply enjoys talking about herself. Either way, you need information about that. Men sometimes become so focused on keeping a woman interested that they don't notice they're carrying the entire interaction. Every silence gets rescued, every new topic comes from them. Every question goes one direction. Then afterward they say, "The conversation went amazingly. Did it? Or did you perform for 90 minutes while she attended?" Good connection has movement in both directions. You shouldn't have to drag curiosity out of someone. That's why one of the most attractive things you can communicate without saying it directly is, "I'm interested in you, but I'm paying attention to how you treat me too." You don't need to announce this. Your behavior reveals it. You're warm when she's warm. You invest when she invests. You make plans, but you notice whether she makes room for them. You ask questions, but you notice whether she's curious about your world too. This isn't keeping score over every message. Healthy relationships aren't 50-50 every single day. Sometimes one person gives more because the other is struggling, but early attraction especially needs reciprocity. Otherwise, you can spend months trying to say the right things to someone whose behavior has been quietly telling you that she isn't interested enough. And when you do notice genuine interest, don't sabotage it by suddenly becoming someone else. This happens all the time. You're relaxed while you're uncertain whether she likes you. You joke naturally. You speak freely. Then she makes it obvious she's attracted to you, and suddenly your brain goes, "Don't mess this up." Now you're monitoring every word. You're replying faster, you're giving more compliments, you're becoming excessively careful. The man she became interested in starts disappearing under the weight of his own anxiety. Brother, attraction isn't a fragile glass object you have to protect with perfect behavior. If the connection is healthy, you should gradually become more comfortable being yourself, not less. Let interest give you confidence to open up, not fear that you're one imperfect sentence away from losing everything. There's another powerful communication skill that has nothing to do with clever lines, knowing how to apologize properly. Strong men don't become weaker when they admit they were wrong. If you said something unfair, say, "That was unfair, I shouldn't have said it like that." Notice what's missing. No 10-minute explanation about why technically she made you angry first. No, "I'm sorry you felt that way." No apology immediately followed by an accusation, just accountability. And ironically, a man who's capable of admitting mistakes often appears more secure because his entire identity isn't threatened by being wrong. Insecure people need to defend everything. Secure people can separate one bad decision from their entire sense of worth. They correct it and move forward, but accountability has to work both ways. If you're constantly apologizing simply to end conflict while she never acknowledges her own behavior, you're not creating peace. You're purchasing temporary silence with your self-respect. That's why communication needs standards underneath it. You can say, "I understand why that upset you, and I could have handled my part better, but what you said afterward wasn't okay either." That's not deflection if you're genuinely owning your part. Two people can both contribute to a bad interaction. Mature communication isn't about identifying one permanent villain and one permanent victim. It's about both people becoming capable of examining themselves without needing the other person to be completely wrong first. And perhaps one of the biggest mistakes men make is revealing everything too quickly, because intense disclosure can feel like instant connection. You've known her 3 days, and suddenly you're telling her every betrayal, every childhood wound, every insecurity, every relationship disaster you've ever experienced. Vulnerability itself isn't weakness, but intimacy needs pacing. Trust should have time to develop. Let people earn deeper access to you through consistency, just as you earn deeper access to them. Share things because the relationship naturally reached that level, not because you're trying to manufacture closeness overnight. There's something much healthier about two people gradually discovering each other than two strangers unloading their entire emotional histories and mistaking intensity for intimacy. So brother, after all these conversations about attraction, words, confidence, and psychology, remember what actually makes communication powerful. It isn't some sentence that secretly bypasses a woman's judgment and forces her to become emotionally attached. It's the fact that your words aren't disconnected from your character. You say no when you mean no. You say yes when you genuinely want to. You listen because you're curious. You tease because the moment is playful, not because you're trying to lower her confidence. You compliment without begging for something back. You admit mistakes without collapsing into shame. You disagree without turning hostile. And when interest isn't mutual, you don't keep talking harder as if the perfect combination of words will eventually unlock her. That's the deepest form of conversational confidence, understanding that your job isn't to make every woman become obsessed with you. Your job is to communicate clearly enough that the right woman can understand who you are, and to remain grounded enough that if she doesn't want what she sees, you don't lose yourself trying to change her mind. Here's another thing that makes a man's communication feel completely different. He isn't constantly asking permission to be himself. Pay attention to how insecurity changes language. Instead of saying, "I actually like that place," a nervous man says, "This might sound stupid, but I kind of like that place." Instead of saying, "I disagree," he says, "Maybe I'm wrong, and obviously you probably know better, but I was just thinking." He's apologizing before he's even expressed an opinion. And when that becomes a pattern, it communicates uncertainty about your own judgment. You don't need to become arrogant or act like everything you think is unquestionably correct. You simply stop shrinking every statement before it leaves your mouth. Say what you think. If new information changes your mind, change it. Confidence isn't believing you're always right. It's believing you can survive being wrong without needing to make yourself smaller beforehand. And when she asks you something personal, don't automatically give the answer you think will sound most impressive. Maybe she asks what you're looking for. A lot of men immediately start calculating, what answer will make me seem desirable without looking too interested? Brother, just answer the question. If you're looking for something serious, say that. If you're genuinely not ready for a relationship, say that too. What destroys trust isn't wanting different things, it's pretending you want the same thing, long enough to get someone's attention. Clear communication may occasionally cost you an opportunity, but sometimes that's exactly what clarity is supposed to do. If your intentions don't match, discovering that early saves both people months of confusion. A man who knows what he wants doesn't need to disguise it because he's not trying to be compatible with everyone. Another thing people remember is how you make difficult conversations feel. Anybody can be charming when everything is going perfectly. The real test comes when there's misunderstanding. Maybe she says something that bothers you. Maybe you accidentally offend her. Maybe plans change. Does the entire interaction suddenly become a courtroom where somebody has to win? Or can you slow things down and say, "Okay, I think we're misunderstanding each other here." That sentence sounds simple, but the mindset behind it matters. You're not treating disagreement as a threat to your identity. You're trying to understand what actually happened. Emotional safety isn't created by never having conflict. It's created by discovering that conflict doesn't automatically become chaos. Learn to ask questions when you're uncertain, instead of creating stories inside your head. She seems quieter than usual, and insecurity immediately whispers, "She's losing interest." Maybe she is, but maybe she's exhausted. Maybe something happened at work. Maybe she's thinking about something completely unrelated to you. Instead of spending 6 hours analyzing her punctuation, you can simply ask, "You seem a little quiet today. Everything good?" Then listen to the answer. Men create enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering by treating assumptions as evidence. Strong communication pulls things out of imagination and places them into reality. Ask, observe, then respond to what actually exists, instead of fighting a scenario your anxiety invented. There's also power in being able to change the emotional direction of a conversation without dismissing what's happening. Maybe both of you have been discussing something serious for 20 minutes. The issue has been understood. Nothing productive is coming from repeating it again. A socially aware man recognizes when it's time to let the conversation breathe. He might smile and say, Okay, we've officially solved enough of the world's problems for tonight. I'm getting food. That doesn't mean avoiding important discussions. It means understanding that relationships cannot survive if every interaction becomes emotional analysis. People need depth, but they also need lightness. They need serious conversations and completely ridiculous ones. Healthy connection has range. And don't underestimate how attractive enthusiasm can be when it's genuine. Some men believe confidence means always looking emotionally unaffected. They deliberately speak in monotone voices, suppress excitement, and act like nothing impresses them because they think detachment makes them mysterious. Brother, that's not confidence, that's acting bored. If you're passionate about something, let it show. If a story genuinely makes you laugh, laugh. If you're excited about a project, talk about it with energy. People are often drawn toward people who are alive inside their own lives. The important distinction is that your enthusiasm isn't entirely dependent on her. You already had things that excited you before she arrived. She gets invited into your energy. She doesn't become its only source. When there's a neutral or not inturig and dig, and hard for the evening. Sometimes conversation is exciting, sometimes it's calm, sometimes neither of you has anything particularly profound to say. That's normal. If you believe you must constantly make her laugh, constantly surprise her, constantly produce excitement, eventually you'll exhaust yourself trying to maintain an image no human being can sustain. A real relationship eventually includes grocery stores, traffic, tired evenings, boring Tuesdays, and conversations about who forgot to buy toothpaste. Attraction that can only survive constant stimulation isn't much of a foundation. Let her experience the ordinary version of you too. Another powerful thing a man can say is simply, I don't like that. No explosion. No 20-minute lecture. Maybe she makes a joke at your expense that crosses a line. Maybe she speaks disrespectfully during an argument. You don't need to retaliate with something worse. You can look at her calmly and say, don't talk to me like that. Then allow the sentence to stand. Brother, men often weaken boundaries by burying them underneath endless explanations. If something genuinely violates your standards, clarity matters more than volume. And if respectful communication repeatedly changes nothing, then the next step isn't finding stronger words. It's deciding whether you want to continue participating in the dynamic. Because here's the truth, communication cannot repair a relationship where only one person respects communication. You can learn every technique imaginable. You can become patient, articulate, emotionally aware, playful, direct, and calm. But if the person sitting across from you lies constantly, mocks boundaries, refuses accountability, or deliberately creates confusion, better communication won't magically transform their character. That's why learning how to speak also means learning when to stop speaking. There comes a point where you've explained yourself clearly enough. Repeating the same boundary 17 different ways doesn't make it stronger. Sometimes the strongest sentence is the one you don't need to repeat, because your next decision communicates everything. That's what men searching for psychological tricks usually discover far too late. The most powerful words aren't designed to make another person emotionally dependent on you. They're designed to reveal who you actually are. Your conversation communicates your humor, standards, curiosity, emotional stability, intelligence, ambitions, flaws, and values, and then you allow her to decide what she thinks about them. That's the part insecure men hate, because it means accepting that you cannot guarantee the outcome. You could communicate beautifully, and she still might not want you. That's okay. The goal isn't becoming irresistible to every woman you meet. The goal is becoming secure enough to speak naturally without twisting yourself into whatever personality you think will receive approval. Because once you're comfortable being fully understood, even knowing someone may choose to walk away, you stop communicating from fear. And brother, words spoken without that fear carry a completely different kind of weight. And brother, once you reach this level of communication, you begin understanding something most men completely overlook. The person who controls the pace of his own emotions doesn't need to control the conversation. He doesn't panic when she changes the subject. He doesn't force a joke when the mood becomes quiet. He doesn't immediately become uncomfortable because she gives an answer he wasn't expecting. He stays present. That's rare because most people aren't actually listening during conversations. They're predicting. They're thinking 3 sentences ahead, trying to figure out where the interaction is going and whether they're getting the response they want. But when you stop trying to control the destination, you become much better at responding to what's happening right now. She says something unexpected. Explore it. She disagrees? Let her explain. She tells you something personal? Don't rush past it because you already prepared another topic. The strongest conversational presence often comes from a man who isn't desperately trying to steer every second toward attraction. And there's something else you need to understand about confidence. You don't have to prove that nothing affects you. Somewhere along the way, men were taught that being emotionally strong means responding to everything with complete indifference. She says something disrespectful? Pretend you don't care. She disappoints you? Act unaffected? Something genuinely hurts? Never admit it. Brother, that's not emotional control. Sometimes that's emotional avoidance. You can calmly say, yeah, that bothered me, without collapsing into drama. In fact, there's something much more grounded about a man who can identify exactly what he's feeling and communicate it without demanding that someone rescue him from it. The weak position isn't having an emotion. The weak position is allowing that emotion to take control of everything you say next. That's why timing matters so much during difficult conversations. If you're furious, maybe that isn't the moment to send the paragraph you've rewritten 12 times. Sometimes the strongest thing you can say is, I'm too annoyed to have a useful conversation about this right now. Let's talk later. Then actually come back and talk later. You're not disappearing to punish her. You're preventing temporary emotion from creating permanent damage. People say things during anger that they spend months trying to repair afterward. Emotional discipline isn't suppressing conflict forever. It's knowing when you're capable of handling conflict intelligently and when your nervous system needs 20 minutes before your mouth should be trusted. And when you return to the conversation, talk about what happened instead of attacking who she is. There's a huge difference between saying, when you cancelled at the last minute without telling me, that annoyed me, and saying, you're selfish and you never respect anybody. One addresses behavior, the other attacks identity. Once you start attacking identity, people naturally become defensive because now they're no longer discussing one situation, they're defending their entire character. This applies both ways. If she brings up something you did, listen for the actual complaint instead of immediately hearing, she thinks I'm a terrible man. Maybe she simply wants one behavior changed. Mature communication keeps problems the size they actually are, instead of turning every mistake into evidence that the entire relationship is broken. And don't use someone's vulnerability against them later. This is one of those things that can destroy trust faster than almost anything else. Maybe she tells you about something she's insecure about. Maybe she admits something painful from her past. Months later, you're arguing, and suddenly that information becomes ammunition. You know exactly where the wound is, so you hit it because you're angry. You may win the argument for 30 seconds, but something much bigger gets damaged. People remember whether they were safe being honest with you, and once someone learns that anything they reveal can eventually become a weapon, they'll start hiding themselves. If you want someone to speak openly around you, prove through your behavior that honesty won't later be punished. The same goes for humor. Teasing can create incredible chemistry, but the moment you discover something genuinely sensitive, stop treating it like material. There is a difference between joking about her taking forever to choose food and repeatedly joking about something she has clearly told you hurts. Social intelligence means knowing when the joke stopped being fun for both people. And if she says, I don't like when you joke about that, you don't need to argue that she should be less sensitive. You can simply stop. Brother, respect isn't losing your edge. You can still be playful, sarcastic, confident, and funny, while understanding that another human being has boundaries. In fact, humor becomes much better when the other person knows you're laughing with them, rather than quietly trying to establish superiority over them. Mantadak. Another thing strong communicators understand is that you don't need immediate resolution to every disagreement. Sometimes two people genuinely see something differently. You explain your position, she explains hers, neither person changes their mind, and that's okay. You can say, yeah, I don't think we're going to agree on this one, then move on. Not every disagreement requires a winner. If you're only comfortable in relationships where the other person eventually accepts your interpretation of everything, you're not looking for connection, you're looking for obedience. The better question is whether the disagreement involves something fundamental. Different opinions about a movie? Who cares? Completely different values around loyalty, money, family, or the future? Now, the disagreement may actually reveal incompatibility. Wisdom means knowing the difference. And this is why you need to become comfortable asking direct questions when something genuinely matters. Men sometimes spend months decoding vague behavior because they're afraid the answer might hurt. What are we? Does she actually want something serious? Is she still interested? Instead of endlessly analyzing signs, there comes a point where clarity is worth the risk. I'm enjoying this, and I'm interested in seeing where it goes. What are you looking for? That's not needy, that's information. Neediness would be hearing an answer you don't like, and then trying to negotiate someone into wanting something different. Confidence asks the question and respects the answer. Sometimes clarity brings two people closer, sometimes it tells you to leave. Both outcomes are better than spending 6 months living inside ambiguity because you are afraid to know. And if she tells you something you don't want to hear, brother, listen carefully before reacting. Maybe she isn't ready for a relationship. Maybe she wants something different. Maybe her feelings simply aren't as strong as yours. Your instinct may be to convince her. You start listing reasons you'd be good together. You remind her of your chemistry. You explain how different things could become. But attraction isn't a courtroom argument. If someone clearly tells you they don't want what you want, the strongest response is often accepting the information. You don't have to insult her. You don't need to disappear dramatically. You simply stop investing romantically, where romantic interest isn't being returned. That's one of the hardest conversational skills because it requires your self-respect to become stronger than your desire for a particular outcome. That's the paradox behind truly powerful communication. The less desperately you need your words to control another person's feelings, the more authentic those words become. You're no longer calculating every sentence based on whether it increases attraction. You're saying what you actually mean. You can tell her she's beautiful because you think she's beautiful, not because you're purchasing affection. You can disagree because your opinion matters too. You can apologize because being wrong doesn't destroy your ego. You can express desire because wanting someone doesn't make you weak. And you can hear rejection because another person's preference doesn't erase your worth. That's what sits underneath the kind of communication people remember. Not tricks, not hidden commands, not psychological manipulation, it's congruence. The man speaking and the man living are the same person. And when somebody realizes your words aren't constantly changing according to whatever response you're hoping to receive, brother, that's when those words begin carrying weight. And brother, there's another layer to this that most men don't recognize until they've spent enough time around confident people. Powerful communication isn't always about saying something clever. Sometimes it's about refusing to say something you don't mean. Think about how often men make promises in the early stages of attraction because the moment feels good. I'll always be here. I'd never do that to you. You're different from everyone I've met. Maybe you genuinely feel those things in the moment, but you've known this person for 3 weeks. Slow down. Your words become valuable when reality consistently supports them. If you say you'll call tomorrow, call tomorrow. If you say you'll be somewhere at 7, show up at 7. If you make a promise, treat it like a promise. Reliability may not sound as exciting as some mysterious psychological technique, but over time it creates something far more powerful than temporary excitement: trust. And once someone learns that your words consistently match your actions, you don't need to keep convincing them that you're different. They experience the difference, and this is why you should be careful about throwing around emotional language before the relationship has earned it. Intensity can feel incredible in the beginning. 2 people meet, chemistry explodes, they're texting until 3 in the morning, telling each other things they've never told anyone, talking about trips 6 months away. It feels like destiny because everything is happening so quickly. But brother, speed can create the illusion of depth. Real intimacy isn't measured by how much information you exchange in 7 days. It's measured by what happens after enough time has passed for both people to become inconvenient. How do you communicate when you're tired? When you're disappointed? When attraction isn't doing all the work? When one of you makes a mistake? That's where words stop being romantic entertainment and start revealing character. Another thing that makes a man's communication stand out is that he doesn't constantly fish for compliments. He doesn't say, "I'm probably not your type," hoping she'll reassure him. He doesn't insult himself, so she'll tell him he's attractive. He doesn't constantly ask, "Do you miss me?" because he needs emotional confirmation every few hours. Everyone needs reassurance occasionally. That's human. But when reassurance becomes the fuel your confidence requires, the other person eventually feels responsible for maintaining your self-esteem. Brother, build a sense of worth that exists before the conversation begins. Then, when she compliments you, you can simply smile and say, "Thank you," instead of desperately squeezing the moment for more validation. And when she compliments you, learn to actually receive it. This sounds small, but insecure people often destroy compliments the second they receive them. She says, "You look really good tonight," and he immediately says, "No, I don't. I look terrible." Now she has to defend her own compliment. Or he becomes arrogant and says, "Yeah, I know." Neither response is necessary. Smile. "Thank you. You look pretty good yourself." Done. Confidence doesn't need to reject appreciation or turn it into proof of superiority. You let someone give you something positive without making the moment awkward. That ability to receive matters just as much as your ability to give. And learn how to communicate attraction without turning the entire interaction sexual. If every compliment is about her body, every joke becomes suggestive, and every conversation somehow gets dragged towards sex, she learns very quickly what part of her you're paying attention to. Physical desire is normal, and if attraction is mutual, sexual tension can naturally develop. But there's something different about a man who can be attracted to a woman without immediately reducing the entire connection to that attraction. He notices her humor, her intelligence, the strange way she tells stories, the things she cares about. He can flirt without making every interaction feel like he's trying to reach the same destination as quickly as possible. That patience communicates that desire isn't controlling him. And this is where restraint becomes more important than performance. Maybe you could make another joke. You don't need to. Maybe you could send another message after she hasn't answered the first one. You wait because there's nothing else that actually needs saying. Maybe you're tempted to tell her everything you're feeling after one incredible date. You allow the experience to settle first. Restraint isn't deliberately withholding affection to create anxiety. It's simply refusing to let excitement make every decision. Attraction can accelerate your emotions much faster than reality develops. Your mind can build a future around someone before you've even seen how they handle frustration. Give reality enough time to catch up with imagination. Another powerful quality is consistency in how you speak about other people. Pay attention to this, brother. If you're incredibly respectful toward her, but cruel to the waiter, arrogant toward strangers, and constantly insulting every ex you've ever had, eventually she'll notice. Communication isn't only the words directed at the person you're trying to impress. Character leaks out through how you describe people who have nothing to offer you. You don't need to pretend every previous relationship was wonderful. Maybe someone genuinely hurt you. Tell the truth if it becomes relevant. But if every story somehow ends with you being perfect and everyone else being crazy, intelligent people eventually start wondering what the missing half of those stories sounds like. And if she tells you about her previous relationships, resist the urge to immediately compete with men who aren't even in the room. She mentions an ex who took her somewhere expensive, and suddenly you're thinking about how you'll top it. She says someone she dated was 6'4", and now your confidence changes. Why? Brother, her past isn't standing beside you during the conversation. You are. If she constantly compares you to former partners, that's a separate issue worth noticing. But don't create comparisons yourself. You don't need to defeat every man who existed before you. You're not applying to replace somebody. You're discovering whether the connection in front of you works on its own terms. And here's one of the hardest things to communicate when you're deeply attracted to someone. This isn't working for me, because desire makes men negotiate against themselves. They recognize incompatibility, but keep hoping chemistry will eventually solve it. She wants something completely different from life. Communication is consistently painful. Trust keeps breaking, yet he stays because attraction tells him leaving would be a loss. Brother, sometimes the strongest conversation isn't the one that brings two people closer. Sometimes it's the conversation where you calmly admit that continuing would make both people's lives worse. Walking away respectfully doesn't erase what was good. It simply recognizes that something can be meaningful without needing to become permanent. And that's where you finally understand why certain men seem to carry so much weight when they speak. It isn't because they memorize better lines. It's because they don't use words to escape reality. They don't promise what they can't deliver. They don't fake agreement to gain approval. They don't pretend they're indifferent when they care. They don't pretend they're committed when they aren't. They can say, "I like you," and mean it. They can say, "That bothered me," without exploding. They can say, "I was wrong," without feeling humiliated. And when necessary, they can say, "This isn't right for me," and actually walk away. That's why their words feel different, brother. There's consequence behind them. Their language isn't designed to control another person's emotions. It's designed to accurately represent the man speaking. And when your words, standards, and actions begin telling the same story, you become far more compelling than any psychological trick could ever make you.